afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We at Capita are an ideas lab focused on harnessing the power of big ideas to ensure a future in which all young children and their families flourish. And we were pleased to partner with KnowledgeWorks in the creation of the first ever 10-year forecast looking ahead for young children and their families. The purpose of this forecast is to inform organizations and individuals that aim to serve young children and families about the future landscape and to encourage strategic action today to ensure a brighter future for all young children. The purpose of this is really to move us from reactive modes of thinking to more proactive mindsets. Like KnowledgeWorks' Future of Learning forecast, this forecast provides critical analysis of changes happening in the broader environment and culture. It's addressed to a broad range of stakeholders, including leaders, advocates, thought leaders, fostering young children's development and well-being, as well as their families' support and well-being, policymakers working in or adjacent to areas affecting young children and their families, innovators and entrepreneurs building ventures focused on meeting the needs of young children and families, and professionals and organizations working for or with young children and their families, or impacting the lives of young children and their families through their policies and practices. The forecast starts with the premise that in a flourishing society, every person would have a strong foundation on which to build a fulfilling life and determine their own path. At Capita, we believe strongly that the foundation for a flourishing future is set in the first 5 years of life, and hence our focus on early childhood. Research across disciplines shows that having these opportunities in the earliest part of life are especially essential because of the science, and we know this from the science of brain development and more. Despite the evidence, society has not yet delivered on its promises of equity, opportunity, and universal dignity and rights for every young child, and for all families. And so that is what brings us here today. It's what brought us to do this work with the forecast. And again, I want to thank our colleagues at KnowledgeWorks for working with us on this. And I'll now turn it back to my colleague, Catherine Prince.
Thanks, Joe. As we delve into discussing the futures of young children and their families today, it's a broad topic and oriented the forecast around 5 critical domains to help us focus on critical issues affecting their well-being and ability to flourish in the future. The first of those, health by numbers, examines how emerging technologies and new understandings of community level health are reshaping how young children's and families' well-being are measured and supported. With learning in flux, we're seeing social and economic uncertainty, as well as new research into the importance of relationships influence approaches to early learning and creating some divergent points of view about what's best for children. We're also seeing autonomy gaps emerge with new notions about young children's autonomy and increasing inequity, creating cultural and generational tensions and widening the disparities among children's access to free expression. With the stretched social fabric domain, we're seeing shifting support structures and information sources change the ways in which increasingly diverse families navigate and access resources. More and more families are taking it upon themselves to find their own solutions, even as governments and other traditional institutions are placing increasing emphasis on supporting young children and families. And lastly, with care at the core, new economic and employment realities are combining with the aging of the population to create tensions related to caregiving structures and values. Within each of these domains, the forecast highlights emerging issues and depicts future possibilities that respond to them. It does so in a highly visual way. It illustrates artifacts of the future, which are objects, roles, places, and practices that could exist in 10 years' time to help bring future possibilities to life and help readers engage with the emerging issues on which we need to take action today. With that overview, I'll hand back to you, Joe, to introduce our panelists.
Great. Thank you. We're joined by a stellar group of panelists today. Dr. Dipesh Navsaria is a pediatrician, a librarian, an educator, and advocate based in Madison, Wisconsin, but somewhere else today, I believe, and professor of pediatrics at the University of Wisconsin. Sheetal Singh is the executive director of the Early Learning Lab in Oakland, California. There, Sheetal leads a number of exciting initiatives focused on leveraging innovative approaches to improve outcomes for young children and families. And Vinny Badalado is the education program director at Vocal. Vinny is a great friend, and at Vocal, he was a funder of this forecast, and so we're grateful for his support. Barbara Dobransky, who was supposed to be on this webinar today, has been unavoidably dealing with a family situation and is unable to join us, and we're grateful that Vinny was able to step forward here at the last minute. So thank you, Vinny, especially to you for being here. Our session today, we will have some questions for these panelists here for the next 30 minutes or so, and we will devote some time at the end to your questions, comments, and observations. To make them, we ask that you type them into the chat box. You can find the chat icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And you can either direct those questions to everyone on the webinar or to Maria Romero, who will be facilitating the responses from our panelists today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to ask our first question to the panelists, and it's really just to describe your first impressions and reactions to the forecast. What struck you about this particular look ahead for young children and families? And we'll start with Dipesh, if that's okay.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate being here. And I am indeed in DC right now, is my undisclosed location. So this, this forecast really, it was so thought-provoking, because I think the approach that was taken to really ask us to keep an open mind and to really think about children and childhood and families in a different way, and to almost do an almost like a small alternate history, and then think about what that means. Is that a future we want? Is it a future we partly want, or is it a future that we don't want at all? I thought was a very novel and intriguing way to really think about the question of children and what it means to flourish. There were some things that I will admit that I had a initial gut reaction to, you know, especially when talking about things like digital media, which is obviously a thing that pediatricians are often dealing with in primary care settings and so on, and I spend a good deal of time talking about. But I stopped and said, okay, let's see what's being said here, right? And it really did offer an opportunity to think about some of our assumptions, to challenge them, and to still sometimes say, yeah, that doesn't change what I think, or to say, I wonder if there's different ways that could be handled. So I thought the forecast really helped, the methodology in it was really intriguing, and I think really brings up a lot of questions and thought-provoking ideas. I think that the underlying core concepts are also key, and really helps us think about this through the lens of history, about where have we been with children and families, and how society interacts and engages with them, and where might we go, and where could we go, and recognizing the influence we have, I think, is in doing any of that is the main thing.
Thank you, Dipesh. Sheetal?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Joe, for inviting me to be on here. And I just have to say kudos to Capita and KnowledgeWorks. I thought this was such a provocative and important piece. And I'm just so happy that it has come into being. My big takeaway and what I really loved about this report is the holistic kind of systems thinking approach to thinking about childhood. As someone who has been working in the early childhood field, that was very attractive to me coming into this field, because I like to think about the broad range of programs and services and ways that we think about children and families and how that all affects them. And I all too often have found that in the early childhood sector, and Dipesh, I know that you're adjacent to that, but we, I think, have been entrenched in this very siloed way of looking at our programs and our systems, that I think we really need to take more of this intersectional and integrated approach, because we are constantly trying to solve problems and not able to, because we are not really thinking about the whole range of experiences that children and families have. So I think this is an important step forward in provoking that thinking and really getting people to get out of those silos. So they're not just thinking about assessments, or not just thinking about teacher training programs, or not just thinking about the pediatric setting as isolated areas, but I would really love to see more of this holistic approach to thinking about children and what children need to thrive or flourish, as you say. I also have to say, I love the format, and the artifacts from the future, I think, are a really great way of getting people to engage with concepts that can be kind of abstract and maybe polarizing, to really provoke some thinking. And parts of reading this also were a little Black Mirror for me. So that's it was fun. So I also appreciate that you put something together that is informative, and also interesting to read.
Great, thank you, Sheetal. So Vinny is texting me that he is having some technical difficulties with Zoom, and so we're going to bring it right back to you, Dipesh, if we could. The challenges, as you've already identified, the challenges are clear here, right? And so we really wanted you to also reflect on the opportunities, and you've already pointed to some of those challenges. For example, the challenges around digital media and continued acceleration around digital media in the future. But what opportunities stand out here, in addition to those challenges that you've already started to identify?
Thank you. I think the largest single opportunity I see is really the possibility to remake how we as a society think about children, and not just in terms of like a overall broader, oh, this is how we view children, but even to enshrine that somewhat in terms of, legal codes and so on. Interestingly, I don't know how many of the people on the webinar have ever looked at, so for example, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child. I only found that a few years ago, and it's really astonishing how forward-thinking that is, and how much it articulates some of the things that actually are elements in this forecast, about children's autonomy, and also about the need to protect and promote the capability and capacity of children, which you would think would be high up there given the developmental needs of children compared to, say, those of adults. How, for example, children are more susceptible to marketing because of their developmental stages, versus thinking about, an adult who, in theory at least, can tell the difference between the two. So I think that some of the work to say, why are we not putting children's needs at the forefront? There are proposals that I've seen, some of which I've made informally at least. We talk about, when doing legislation, we talk about, fiscal impact statements. How much is this going to cost? Should there be a childhood impact statement, or a next generation impact statement or something, to, as reasonably as we can, say, what is the impact of doing this, not just for now, not just on the dollar line, but really thinking about this across the longer view, at least a few years or a generation down if possible. So I think thinking about those impacts and saying that we need to make sure that we're not inadvertently kicking a can down the road and doing something that may not be useful in the end is really critical. I think that could also guide how we think about doing different things. I think that, for example, I think that some of the people who are creating technology that is child-focused, but ultimately misguided. I'm thinking of products that are designed, you don't need to soothe your child at night because this product will automatically turn on lights and music. Well, that's not the same as having a parent responding to that child and holding them, talking to them, singing to them, patting them, whatever the case may be. I'd like to believe that it wasn't just about a cynical, manipulative profit motive, right? But who did they talk to, and did they actually think about the bigger picture of where children and families are? So I think we have an opportunity here to really take some of these elements. I was particularly struck by some things like the scorecard around child-centered communities, or the pediatric urban designer, right? Because here's the reality that we have. If you do work with children in almost any field, if you're the person working on children and not on general societal or adults, you get paid less. You don't get as many resources. This is true in medicine. It's true in social work. It's definitely true in teaching. So we need to recognize that. And of course, the irony there is that, children are 25% of our population. They are only 8% of our federal budget, but yet they're 100% of our future.
We'll go to you now and then come back to Vinny, really to the first question, because he's now back on.
Okay. Well, I would say in terms of opportunities, I really love that idea of the childhood impact statement. I think that as I was reflecting on opportunities and challenges that were brought up in this report, I found that some of them were the same things. There are flip sides to both of them. I think generally, that we have a political will to really improve the way that we support children and families that we're seeing. It's a bipartisan issue. I think that's a huge opportunity for us to leverage. We're definitely seeing that with new administrations, here in California and in other states like Colorado. I think that I noticed that there were some of the ideas that really resonated with me through this report, like the 3D printed house or the care co-op. I was struck that they're actually pulling from, while they're future looking, they're also pulling from more traditional ways of thinking about children and families, multi-generational households, and ideas that really pull in this whole idea that it takes a village to raise a child. Cliche, I know, but true, right? And I also think that, and this was something that wasn't called out specifically in the report, but the changing nature of work also provides an opportunity for us, if we do this correctly, to really think about care, both intergenerationally, and then how parents might have more flexibility in the way that they're being able to care for their kids, and how that should also be accommodated. One thing that I do think is an opportunity that I hope to see is more of a breaking down of the barriers between the social sector. So traditionally, the people who are making the policies or the decisions or designing the programs for families, and the actual families that they're serving the people. I think that there is a trend to, I hope, more co-design, so that we are not doing unto people so much as working with them. And then, some of the things that I think are both a positive and a negative are a huge opportunity in data. A lot of what this report touches upon are the power that we now have, not just to capture data, but also analyze and really make sure that we're working in a way that's really going to support the needs of children and families. But then there's a lot of fear for good reason as well about who gets to see that data and what happens to it. I think this is something that we just have not figured out, and we're in a really bad place right now. But we could get to a better place as well. And I know that there's a lot of attention to that. I don't want to take up too much time, so I will hand it over to Vinny so he could start
Great.
to.
Thank you. Vinny, could you not only address the opportunities that stand out, but also initial reactions to the forecast as well?
Sure, absolutely. And apologize for dropping out for a minute. My internet decided it didn't want to be cooperative, so I'm on my phone now, and that's why I don't see a video. So apologize about that. But the initial reaction, at first, as someone who was very invested both, personally and with professional dollars in the point of this report, I was excited to see all of the learning that came out of it, and not only just the report itself, but the back work that went into it, and the gathering of groups over the course of several months of just bringing different thoughts and ideas into the fray, and using the strategic futures focused thought process to really get at some of the issues that were that arrived with the final report. And I think one of the things that really stood out for me as I read through this report is that the idea of supports and relationships is woven into all of these domains. And that is something that I think, as we could probably tell just from the way things are occurring and the polarized nature of society and politics today, that we've sort of gotten away from the idea about relationships and relational types of work to an extent. And I think the fact that this report brings that to the forefront is really, I think, beneficial, useful, and a great reminder to all of us about where we need to be, especially when we're talking about young children and families over the course of the next 10 years. As in terms of opportunities, I think there's a lot of really intriguing opportunities here, especially from my perspective as a funder and an impact investor through Vocal. We focus primarily on the opportunity gap in education, but we have a keen interest in early childhood as a place to address those opportunity gaps early on, of course. So for us and for my work, I think that the recommendations are extremely important to keep at the forefront of how I'm thinking about and how others in the space are thinking about what role does innovation and technology have in helping create a flourishing future. You're seeing a lot of interest now in the funding community, in the investment community, in this idea of getting into the early childhood space. I think most people are interested in it because there's a important aspect that technology and innovation can do to improve the lives of young children and families. But I think there's a lot of profit motive involved, and I think both other speakers have spoke about this in terms of data and in terms of being careful and measured about how we use technology to improve the lives of young children. I think this report has a lot of key points and asks a lot of really intriguing and important questions that funders, entrepreneurs, innovators should really be keeping in the forefront of their minds as they start to explore what the potential would be to utilize technology and other types of innovations to address improving the lives of young children.
Sheetal, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't respond to that last stream of thought from Vinny around the role of digital technology and innovation in positively building a flourishing future. I think, sometimes our default position is that there's a lot to be afraid of, there's a lot to be concerned about. Parents are expressing a lot of those anxieties, but we also need to flip that paradigm and think about what the opportunities there are.
Definitely. I think we have moved to a default position where there is a lot of fear. I think especially in the way that millennial parents and new families stay connected and form social networks. And the report touches on this. Digital communities play a huge role in many people's lives and allow us to kind of foster connections with a wide range of people who we may not meet in our day-to-day. And I think we should embrace those connections that people are forming and just recognize that community is happening in a different way now than it used to happen maybe 20 years ago, and not shame people for that. And I think that Vinny brings up a really important point, which is always going to be in the background, which is as we turn to technology and products to improve our lives, we always do have to kind of acknowledge that tension between the profit motive versus how they can improve our lives. So I will, acknowledge that as well. I think it's something that we all need to be aware of. But in addition to communication technologies, as I touched upon, the data capturing, I think, can really help us be smart about resources, especially public resources and dollars, and being able to triage and really target services to people based on what they need, rather than continuing with a one-size-fits-all model, whether it's in the education sector or across social services, etc. I think we're moving into a new era in terms of really being able to understand people and what they need, and acknowledging that not everyone is going to need the same thing. And just also kind of touching on, and the report does talk about recognizing that not everyone is the same. There are going to be cultural differences in parenting. I think that is, I'm going a little off topic here, Joe, but also something that we have to acknowledge, that healthy parenting and even healthy child development might look different to different people. And so that is something that we need to come to terms with. So we're not having this top-down approach where we're telling people what to do. But also just being very careful then not to create like a two-tiered system where some people are more privileged than others.
I don't think that's off topic at all. And in fact, I want to ask Depesh to jump in here. As a pediatrician in a diverse community, your patient panel, I would imagine, is incredibly diverse. And you're dealing with all types of different parenting styles, family structures, and that sort of thing. And yet, you and I have talked about this, relationship is at the core, caregiving is at the core. And so I'm just interested as a pediatrician, frontline provider, respond to what Sheetal is saying about the diversity and yet the unity that is found around the reciprocal responsive relationships.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting because when I worked for many years at a federally qualified health center, I was going from an environment where I was working with lower income families, largely African American and Latino immigrants, which, by the way, those two groups already are actually rather different from one another. People make the assumption, oh, it's all those community health center populations. Well, they're actually very different. And then sometimes I'd be going to an evening, call responsibility, doing after hours clinic with a much more middle class, much more Caucasian population, and having to kind of shift a little bit and adjust what you say and how you say on certain topics, as well as just deal with different types of anxieties or concerns or worries. Having said that, I can say virtually all parents, generally speaking, across all these groups, worry when their kid has a fever, right? Irrespective of their education or background or whatever. Or if they're complaining they fall down and their arm hurts, and is there a fracture? I mean, that's a universal. I think I really appreciated what's been said about how do we figure out what's really useful and use data to make sure that it's useful, rather than just kind of fear things. When I do talks on digital media, I'm often saying, I start with a quote from that's about how this new technology is going to ruin the minds of young people, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I reveal that the quote is actually from ancient Greece, and it's talking about writing. which of course sounds ludicrous in our current context, but at the time it was like, well, if you didn't memorize everything, you know, and you just wrote it down, that wasn't the same, and so on. I think what's challenging is that the data is really hard to get and hard to do reliably. A lot of the studies that are out there are either small, not very well done, or frankly have a lot of bias in them because they're being funded by industry or someone, right, with an agenda. And we no longer have such good funding coming from relatively unbiased sources that are really saying, how can we advance the state of knowledge that's out there? So if a parent comes up to me and says, should I do X or Y with my child? The challenge there is sometimes we have a really clear-cut answer to that, right? So for example, we know you should immunize your child, right? We know that that's been a major factor in protecting kids from death and disability and continues to be and should be. But if someone says to me, should I give my child probiotics because I saw the study that said this, well, that's not as clear cut, and it may actually have highly individual variation within it. So I think there's a real need for thinking about better research, better data that may help us articulate what is it that is universal that we know works, what is it that there might be some evidence for, and then what is it something that we're like, any one of this range of possibilities are just fine, and you know it's okay for you to make that choice. One of those things, however, gets back to what you just asked about, Joe, which is about relationships. It's fairly clear that the key, most primal driver of kids' development in the first years of life, and we're talking, you know, certainly the first 3 years of life, is their engagement in nurturing, responsive relationships with loving, caring adults. You know, as Yuri Bronfenbrenner said, like every child needs an adult who's absolutely crazy about them. And that connection is what is really driving development. And we have to be careful about making sure that we're not interfering with that, even in the name of doing something else. How else are we fracturing relationships? And this can actually be fairly far-reaching. For example, issues like paying someone a living wage actually has to do partly with child development. If somebody's working 2 or 3 jobs because they don't make a living wage at any particular one, that's going to be an impediment to their opportunities to do these nurturing relationships that they might know how to do, want to do, you know, and be good at doing, but they're not home because of those sorts of things. So the centrality of relationships, we should always be asking ourselves, is the advice we give, the programs we support, and the policies that we enact, are they protecting those relationships and helping promote them to be as effective as possible?
Great, thank you. Vinny, I want to come back to you on this question about the changing nature of work. And I know as you think about the opportunity gaps and the workforce needs of the future, it's something at top of mind. And, you know, there was a report out this week from Brookings about the role that artificial intelligence will play in disrupting the jobs of those even with 4-year bachelor's degrees. And so I'm just curious, as we think about the intersection between the future of work, the needs of our young children today, and the work that you do to address the opportunity gap, are there any particular insights that you're willing to share that would help us to think, I guess my question is really, help us think better at that nexus? Because we have people who are thinking about the future of work, people who are thinking about the future of young children and families. How do we come together to think about all of those things together in more effective and thoughtful ways?
Wow, Joe, thanks for the softball. That's a really easy question to answer. That's a great one. You know, for me, and from the perspective that I'm approaching this work, I think that you know, it's inevitable that technology is going to continue to increase exponentially in terms of what it's able to do. Thinking mostly about what artificial intelligence is able to perform and do. And it's inevitable that jobs that we thought might be safe from automation are definitely going to be in trouble in some way. There was a study that Oxford, some researchers at Oxford did several years ago that kind of tried to quantify the percentage of what types of what you would think of as white collar jobs, creative type jobs that might be disrupted by AI. And it's pretty large. I think what the big key for me and the big focus that I try to approach the work with is that what is going to keep humans relevant and keep humans being able to enjoy a future that engages, that actually is part of, that has flourishing in it, that where people can flourish in their own way, is going to be our humanity. Is going to be the pieces that I don't think AI will ever be able to approach. And if it will, it's way off into the future, where I'm talking about like empathy, compassion, gratitude, aspects of social-emotional components and soft skills, for lack of a better word, that I think are really going to be crucial in navigating the future. So I think important and inherent in everything we do is preparing for a future where technology takes a lot of the typical types of jobs and work off of a human's plate, but hopefully allows a human to be a more emotional type of entity and allow for our social emotional aspects of humans to come to the forefront. I think that's going to be important in terms of relating to and operating in this future, because machines are going to be able to do a lot of things, but they're not going to be able to satisfy the human component of a lot of it. So how humans are able to work with machines, and going back to the idea around relationships and a relational aspect to how we develop, I think that's going to be even more critical than it has been now and in the past, because that's really what's going to help people stand out. So for me, that's what really I think about in terms of what is necessary to help ensure flourishing over the next 10, 20 years with the advent of really interesting and fascinating advances in AI.
Great. Thanks, Vinny. Let's move to our next question. And as we do, I want to remind everyone that the chat box is open. Feel free to share with the group or directly with Maria Romero if you have any questions for our panelists. We'll be turning to those next, after we hear from our panelists about what challenges are most urgently in need of our attention. Shital, let's start with you.
Well, I just wanted to say something because I love both the statements that Dipesh and Vinny just made. And, I think just to underscore the importance of responsive caregiving, especially in those early years, I think that is something that we could all rally around. Like, that could be the beacon, could be the guiding force for those childhood impact statements. Like, is this a policy or a program that's going to allow for more of that responsive caregiving for children? And what I hope with the whole AI or automation revolution is that not only does it free up time for us to have more, to invest more in our relationships, but we can also come to a point, because that is, I believe, something that machines can never do, and I don't think we want them to do. Maybe it will help us value caregiving as a profession as well. That is, maybe we could start to see teachers, caregivers, etc., be acknowledged for what they can do that computers just can't do. So I will say that. Sorry, that wasn't a challenge again.
But a good thought nonetheless. So thank you for sharing it.
You're welcome. As I mentioned before, I think some of the challenges and opportunities are actually very similar and could be two sides of a different coin. I think that going back to data, it's a big question, and really understanding, the role. I find it really interesting in the work that we've been doing at the lab recently, where we're hitting up some big questions as we're doing some work at the state level around public versus private data and what people feel comfortable sharing, what happens when we don't properly share data and how that leads to inefficiencies in the way that we provide services. But then also conversely, who do people trust? And it's funny because in a lot of the research that we've been doing with users, obviously there's a lot of attention to all of these technology companies and corporations doing bad things with data, and no, we don't trust them, but a lot of people don't trust government either. And we have this weird situation now where people are more worried about government having their data than some of these companies, and will offer their data more readily to private entities who may not be held to the same standards of privacy, which is why I said we're doing a really bad job all around with data right now. It does have so much potential, but I think we need to figure out and figure out this whole trust question around data as well. And, again, I will point back to acknowledging that childhood and parenting looks different for different communities. And I think that is a challenge that we must face again, trying to understand how to be inclusive, not be prescriptive, and not turn people off are two big challenges that I see as needing to address.
Thank you. Dipesh?
So the question says most urgently needs attention. So I'll focus on something that I think is a rising trend that comes out in elements of the report as well. I worry about misinterpretation of the science that does exist. I worry about incomplete understandings, and honestly, sometimes the wishful thinking that comes from that. In the last year alone, I've received a handful of emails asking me to review a product for children that's being developed or considered. I think these are well-intentioned. I'm not even going to go there in the, they're all just out to make a buck, right? But they deeply misunderstand what the science tells us in the service of an idea that they're really wanting to promote. So, for example, one place said, here we're developing this app that puts storybook pages on an iPad. A parent can read the storybook out loud. It'll record their voice and their image reading out loud. And now the parent can hand the iPad to their child, and they're being read to by their parent as many times as they need. And the parent can go do other important parenting things, right? Like laundry or cooking or a shower or whatever, right? And they kept on coming back to, but we know that a child being read to by a parent is really important. I said, yes, a parent, not a recording of a parent. There's a few edge cases that I think there could be used, right? A military deployment or an incarcerated parent, right? But let's ignore those for a moment. And they kept on coming back to, but this is what the science said. And I had to keep explaining, that's not really what the science says. I have other examples like this, or where people are hanging their head on shoddy research. There's a thing that, frankly, the studies they were citing were not even close to statistically relevant and all, but it was published in a very kind of low-end journal, and they said, oh, but there's a study. So I think that one of the challenges we have is that people are taking knowledge and they're sometimes profoundly misapplying it. Again, I think because they're very hopeful that it'll justify what they're looking to do. I think we need better science literacy, and I think we need more interdisciplinary education. I remember when I did my master's in public health, which is now almost 25 years ago, we had a class on HIV/AIDS, which was still a relatively new thing. This was the mid-90s, so not super new, but still kind of very much in the consciousness. And the very first class, I noted that we had not only microbiology types and public health types and medical types, but we even had journalists, right, who were trying to understand this, because it was a class that was meant to cover all aspects of what was happening with HIV. And I was very sad that the journalists all dropped the class after the first to meetings because it covered all the science, and it was a little too sciencey, too much about viral reproduction and all delivered too quickly. And it was like, yes, but these are the folks that we need to understand this so that they can do a good job of reporting this. So we silo so amazingly well in our society. We need to de-silo some of these things like education, so that way we're able to understand these concepts from each other and understand at least how to think about them in ways that don't lead to these hopeful misinterpretations.
Thank you. Vinny?
Yeah, I mean, before I join, I want to put an exclamation point on both what Dipesh and Chital said. I think both of those are really critical pieces that I come up against and see quite a bit in what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. So I love both of those. And for me, one of the biggest challenges that I see, and I think the report does a great job of addressing this and weaving it throughout the report, is the idea around how will innovations and technology and whatnot increase inequality and create more inequities in our systems, both in terms of who might be developing innovations and different types of ways of addressing human flourishing for young children, and also who has access to those innovations. I think that the data is pretty clear about the inequities in our system right now, and I am concerned that technology has a real potential, and innovations have real potential over the next 10 years to just exacerbate that inequality. So it's key to think about when creating an innovation, when approaching a new type of technology to address a particular facet of improving young children's lives, that there's a real deep thought around both the science, the cultural aspect of what we're trying to address, and who has access in the end to these types of innovations in order to hopefully lessen inequality in our society and provide for a more equitable system. So a lot of policymakers, I think, need to start putting that to the forefront of how they're thinking about approaches to early childhood development, and how they're going to start address as it becomes more of a hot political issue, how we start to really address ensuring that the funding goes in the right places and that the innovations are being developed in a really thoughtful and nuanced way.
Great. So thank you, Vinny. We do have a question about recommendations or resources around screen time, digital literacy for caregivers and educators, both in school and in home. Dipesh, Chital, I know that both of you all have been engaged in that in particular. Feel free to answer now, but we can also send some resources from you if you would be amenable to it as a follow-up to this conversation.
I can jump in briefly, and I'll quickly pull up the web URL and put it in the chat box. The AAP guidelines are indeed from 2016. They're usually re-examined at least every 5 years, kind of through an internal process. And I can virtually guarantee you that there'll be an update to these because the world is changing so quickly in that area. A lot of the parenting guidelines, and I'll put that URL in, offer a structure for parents to be able to have a conversation at home, because we recognize that it's hard to have a long extended conversation in the context of a regular checkup visit. And it offers a structure for kind of trying to think about what possible rules and guidance families would like to use, and we let them pick because every family is different. And it also offers brief explanations as to why. The thing that I think is most important about these recommendations is that to the extent possible, they are based on research evidence. There's not great research for a lot of these things. And so that is why the guidelines, for example, steer clear of school, weighing in on school screen recommendations, because that's really more of an education world thing. And I think that's something that needs to be sorted out there. although I can tell you, I don't think the education world is real clear sometimes on exactly what makes for good educational use of screen media at any age, from college all the way down to young children.
And I could just jump in to say that I totally agree with that, Depesh. And I think in the ed tech world, not just early childhood, but also K-12, we're hampered by a lack of evidence of learning outcomes, even for particular products. So, as a field or as a community, I think we need to really be investing more in evaluation. I know it's difficult to do, but super important. And, one other thing I would just say, going to the product that you were describing about being able to record reading and then having the child watch it, it strikes me as really interesting because I think that that's a case of, it's a design issue where we're maybe trying to solve the wrong problem. Like, what is the problem? It shouldn't be, how do we allow the child to watch a video of their parent reading instead? The problem should be, how can we take care of something else so the parent has more time to read to the child, right? And obviously those other things that are standing in the way of the parent reading to the child are complicated or complex and can change from person to person. But can we use our technology to automate doing the laundry? Maybe the laundry pickup and drop off, Uber, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Focus on that and don't try to replace that parent-child relationship with technology.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. They had already developed so much of it, and only then did they ask other people for their opinion. And it's like, I wish you had asked about this much earlier. We could have saved you a lot of work,
That's great. Maria, other questions being asked. Could you share those with us?
Yes. First, I wanted to thank everyone who contributed to the questions in the private chat. I know that not everyone was brave enough to put their question on the public chat. So one of the ones that I've been getting, it's like, what should be or could be the first step to address some of the challenges that you have mentioned?
First step to address some of the challenges that have been identified today.
Mm-hmm.
Vinny, do you want to start out with this one?
Sure. I think, read the report and look at the recommendations. And the one recommendation that really sort of pops out to me and I continually go back to is the idea around placing stability at the center of efforts to improve family life. I think, the conversation we've had today kind of illustrates that, there is a lot of instability already for many families and young children. And I think that instability will probably only increase as, again, jobs become, the future of work challenges us and becomes, there's a different aspect to how we approach careers and how we think about what might be a good career that can last into the future. So I'm thinking that, and I love the idea of keeping stability at the forefront, both in terms of creating innovations, creating policy interventions, anything that we're doing when addressing the lives of young children should be focused on that stability aspect. That for me, I think is that I have thought that before, but having it now in print and the way it's displayed here and presented, I think is really critical. And I would, hope to encourage others to keep that at the forefront of their thinking as they go forward about ensuring that no matter what we do to enhance or utilize technology or innovations or anything else to change the way we address the lives of young children and families, that we think about stability as the number one key to make sure that that's done in an appropriate way.
Thank you. We are beginning to run short on time, so Maria, I want to turn it back to you and see if you could just share a couple of other questions, and then we could let Depesh, Sheetal, and Vinny respond to them as final thoughts.
Yes. So I have another question here. It's, how can there be clear definitions about instructional and consumptive screen time? And then another question, it's what are you or your organizations currently doing that could create more solid foundations for young children and their families? Kind of what is covered in the forecast. And then ultimately, was there like something that you find surprising about in the forecast, something that came up to you, maybe like one of the artifacts of the future? I know that you've mentioned a few already, but if there was anything else that you wanted to mention.
We'll leave it there and answer those questions as best as you can. We'll start with Depesh.
Yeah, so screen time definitions are tricky, and we used to kind of talk about number of hours and things like that, and the last recommendations actually backed off from trying to really define time, because you know, it's kind of like trying to say you should eat this many ounces of food, when, you know, it's one thing if you're talking about an infant who gets one thing, right? But this many ounces of food, you know, we don't sit there and talk only about weight. It's also, what are you eating? Is it this many ounces of, you know, something healthy, or is it this many ounces of Twinkies, you know, or things like that? So the definitions, and then how do you actually say what's quality? That's part of what makes it so challenging, you know, is what makes quality, and especially when you have boxes on and online ads telling you this is educational and there's no evidence for that assertion. Where does that leave parents, right? It just kind of leaves them high and dry. So your question is a good one, because it's not an easy one to answer. As for what organizations are doing, so depending on which organization I'm representing at the moment, let's say, you know, the American Academy of Pediatrics, we're constantly working on what is best for children, what does the evidence tell us, and what can we do to effectively message that. The parenting portal, the policy statements, all those sorts of things, really try to ensure that we're dreaming of the best possibility for all children, irrespective of their background, their socioeconomic status, you know, whatever the case may be, their disabilities, so on and so forth. There's really a ton of amazing work there, and it really is centered around children and their overall well-being. One of the things I adore about the AAP is that really we focus on kids and not so much on us, the pediatricians. Yes, we do some pediatrician advocacy, but I always argue we got the name right. It's the American Academy of Pediatrics, not pediatricians. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Depesh. Sheetal.
Yeah, so just quickly, I love that question about what was surprising in the report, so I will tackle that. I had not really thought about that whole section on the autonomy gap. That was really interesting for me and thought-provoking. I would also say, you know, to echo Vinny's comment about stability, another huge force that I think was not in the report, but we have to acknowledge is climate change. The effects that it's happening like everywhere. And also then to just jump to what our organization is doing. So, you know, I've spoken a lot about acknowledging that it's hard to really define what quality is, and, you know, understanding that there are different aspects to parenting. We have a framework that we have developed that we're really trying to promote that we call the priority practices, which is really just focusing on some key core concepts or ways that we can improve adult-child interactions, whether that's between parent and child, caregiver and child, or teacher and child. And it's very, very focused on this idea of responsive caregiving. And so rather than get hung up on you know, being too prescriptive, it's just really putting this idea of responsive caregiving out there and working to promote that. That's going to be a core focus of our work over the next coming years. And so we really think that is a good way to approach this.
Great. Thank you. And Vinny, final thought.
Yeah, final thought. So Sheetal took mine, because the autonomy gaps was definitely the most surprising for me. I hadn't really thought about it, as she said, in the same way either. So I really found that section of the report to be quite interesting and really important bring forward, because that's something that, again, hasn't come to my viewpoint when approaching different aspects of early childhood development and innovations. And Vocal, we continue to try to figure out, I mean, my section of Vocal, the education side, is focused on opportunity gaps and how do we address those educational opportunity gaps, looking at innovations and potentially, as technology changes, what might be the potential there, but all the mind keeping a really clear eye on racial justice, economic justice, and educational justice. So that way we're ensuring that we're doing things in a way that don't exacerbate inequality and inequities, but actually try to close those gaps. So that's just a little bit of that, our work.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together. I want to thank our panelists again for your participation. Also want to shout out my colleagues at KnowledgeWorks, Catherine Prince and Maria Romero and Kate Westrix for being here and for helping and collaborating with us on this project. And of course, a final thank you to all of our funders who are listed in the report and our contributors to the report for supporting such forward-leaning and frankly unusual work. And so very grateful to all of them. The webinar has been recorded. We will share that with you all and so that you can share it on. We appreciate your time and hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks again.